Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Neme. I'm the moderator for and one of the speakers for this RAP Regulatory Systems Project webinar on energy efficiency as a T&D resource. For those of you who don't know, RAP is a nonprofit organization funded through foundations like the Energy Foundation and ClimateWorks and government agencies such as the U.S. Department of Energy to provide policy and technical assistance to policymakers and regulators. This is the 8th in a series of webinars that RAP has organized, and most of which I've moderated, with funding support from the Energy Foundation to help Energy Foundation grantees, regulatory staff, and others become better informed on a variety of key topics related to energy efficiency. We have today some distinguished experts with very important expertise and experience to share with you, which we hope you will find useful, particularly my colleagues from Con Edison. Before we get started, I wanted to touch briefly on some administrative and logistic issues. The first is that the webinar is being recorded, and that when we are done here, copies of the recording and the presentations will be available on RAP's website at www.raponline.org. So if it was so good that you just didn't get enough the first time around, you can go listen again or tell your friends about it. Secondly, I wanted to note, since we'll have a fair number of people listening in, that for questions, we're going to ask you to type them into the chat box on the GoToWebinar screen. And we'll take questions at the end of each of the 2 different presentations. Each of us will talk for 40 to 45 minutes. I'll take questions at the end of my presentation until around 1 o'clock, until around 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and then hand the controls over to Michael Harrington and Ronny Sandoval at Con Ed, and take questions on their presentation at the end of theirs as well. We will do our best to get to all of the questions. But if for some reason we don't, we will, any of us will welcome follow-up emails or phone calls. Last logistics item, I just wanted to note that at the end of, after the webinar is complete, our friends at RAP will send, among other things, an evaluation or a link to a evaluation form, very short, that we would kindly ask that you fill out. The feedback we get on these is taken seriously and is very helpful, and it shouldn't take more than a minute or 2 of your time. So with that, I'm going to try to begin advancing the slides here and get started. So again, my name is Chris Neme. I'm with Energy Futures Group. I do a lot of work for the Regulatory Systems Project, including helping to manage these webinars. My part of this webinar is going to look at a high level, the experience in the U.S. with using efficiency as a T&D resource. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why it is an important topic, the importance of T&D investments. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call passive deferrals of T&D investments through efficiency. Those are deferrals that occur not with the explicit intention of deferring specific substation or other upgrades, but as a byproduct of system-wide efficiency program implementation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about active deferrals, where there are very focused, geographically focused attempts to defer specific T&D investments, and then conclude with some recommendations. So, why do we care about transmission and distribution capacity? I'll begin by noting that energy efficiency has a whole variety of different potential benefits, and it's really probably more than any other type of system resource. They save energy, they reduce the need for peak capacity, they reduce emissions, they reduce line losses, they reduce the need for reserves, they have a variety of non-energy benefits, and they defer the need for transmission and distribution capacity. Now that's a really big deal. This graph shows the historic investment by investor-owned utilities in the U.S. Over the past, roughly over the past decade, and as you can see, they've averaged about $25 billion a year. And again, that's just the investor-owned utilities, which represent only about 2/3 of the electric sales in the country. So if you could extrapolate that number, and we don't know the extent to which that's appropriate, but if you extrapolated it to the whole population or the whole grid in the country, that would be something between $35 and $40 billion a year. That's a lot of money. Most of it is on the distribution side. Now, that's a historic number. And so I'm going to advance here, if I can, to my next slide. Moving slowly. There we go. This is the previous slide was looking backwards. Now this slide is looking forwards, or relatively. We're at the beginning of the period that this forecast was developed for. So for the period 2010 to 2030, the electric utility industry did an assessment of what its capital investment needs would be. And roughly 60% of those capital investment needs were on the transmission and distribution system, and totaling over $900 billion over that 20-year period. That averages something close to $50 billion a year nationally. So again, this is a very big investment, and to the extent that anything can make us more cost-effective and effective at delivering electricity service to ratepayers, that's a good thing. And this, as a result of looking at those numbers, this is clearly an area that deserves at least some focus and attention. Now, it's worth noting that not all investments in the T&D system are deferrable through efficiency investments. There are investments that take place simply because there is old equipment that's dying out and needs to be replaced. It's only those investments in the T&D system that are associated with load growth that are deferrable, but that represents, by at least anecdotally, a significant chunk of them. And as I noted earlier, those deferrals can happen either passively or actively, and we're going to talk more about both of those things. So again, starting with passive deferrals. Different elements of the T&D system experience their peaks at different times. Sometimes it's different seasons, could be summer and/or winter peaking, and sometimes different hours of the day. It depends on the mix of customers that the substation or a feeder or transmission line is serving. It's also worth noting, with respect to efficiency, that most efficiency programs and measures save energy at every hour of the day, all 24. That's not true for every individual participant, but when you look at broad-based programs that are serving many, many different participants, it's generally true for those groups of participants as a whole. There are, of course, some exceptions. Street lighting programs typically save energy only at night hours. Programs that address only cooling efficiency will only save energy during the summer hours, and obviously the opposite is true for those programs targeting heating. However, it is clear that most efficiency programs provide some T&D deferral, at least at some point in the future. This graph kind of underscores that point using, looking at perhaps the most commonly implemented electric efficiency measure, the CFL. You can see that the blue line represents an average load shape or the average portion of the lights that are on it. So the load shape for winter usage, and the red line shows you the same thing for summer usage. And you can see that even at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, something like 3 or 4% of the CFLs that have been distributed through utility-sponsored efficiency programs are on. There is some portion that's on at every hour of the day. Now, some are on, or more commonly on in some hours or in some seasons than others. Clearly, in the wintertime, CFLs are used more than in the summertime. But there is some usage at every hour of the day. So when you're thinking about passive deferrals, there's a variety of questions you should ask yourself. The first is, which T&D systems are going to be affected? As discussed earlier, if you have a broad enough portfolio of efficiency programs serving a wide range of end uses and a wide range of customer types, a large portion of the T&D system will be affected. The second question is, how far into the future will the deferral occur? If you have very aggressive programs, you might start seeing deferrals happen a lot sooner. And obviously, if your programs are not nearly as aggressive, you may be getting some T&D deferrals, but there are deferrals that are happening quite a ways out into the future. And then the last question is, how much deferral will occur? In other words, for how many years are you deferring an upgrade to a substation, for example? The answer to that question is going to be a function of both the load growth on the system or on the different subcomponents of the system and the aggressiveness of the efficiency programs. And again, the more aggressive your programs, the more likely it is that your deferrals will last longer, or in some cases, perhaps eliminate the need for upgrades altogether. So this is just an illustrative slide to hammer home the point that the mixture of efficiency programs that you are offering matters a lot in terms of the ability to defer things, and the time at which the different elements of your T&D system peak matters a lot as well. So here are three hypothetical substations, one of which has a peak during the summertime at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is typically coincident with what a system peak would look like. The second of which would peak at roughly 7 o'clock in the evening on a summer day. That might be more consistent with a substation serving predominantly residential customers with central air conditioning. And a third which would peak in the wintertime at 7 o'clock, probably having a lot of space heating and a lot of residential customers. And to the right-hand side of this table, I presented three different examples of residential programs: a residential CFL program, a residential air conditioner retrofit program, and a commercial high-performance T8 retrofit program. And you can see that each of these programs, for those three different times of and seasons of peak, of substation peaks, generates different amount of savings. As you saw from the load shapes for CFL, the savings from the residential CFL program are going to be highest for the last substation because it peaks in the winter when CFLs are more commonly used than in the summer. Obviously, on the other hand, the residential air conditioner retrofit program isn't going to get you anything in the wintertime. And so again, commercial retrofits will vary. They will tend to provide you greater savings during the times when commercial buildings are more commonly in use, as in the case of the first substation. So the mixture of programs that you have and the specific time of peak for each of the different elements of the T&D system that you're trying to defer matter a lot. All right, trying to advance the slide here. And as noted earlier, savings depth also matters. So here we have another hypothetical scenario where you have an existing substation that has a current load of 95 megawatts and has a growth rate in terms of the demand of 3% per year. If it has a maximum capacity of 100 megawatts, you could see that absent any efficiency program, it's going to need an upgrade by 2014. And if the initial upgrade gets you an extra 20 megawatts and a second upgrade gets you another 20, you would have to upgrade a second time in 2020. Now, the next three rows show you three different levels of aggressiveness in terms of your efficiency portfolio and its impact on load growth for that particular substation. And you can see in the first case, with only 0.5% savings per year, you don't actually get any deferral of the first upgrade. The first upgrade still needs to happen in 2014, just as it would have without the DSM program. However, The second deferral, the second upgrade to the 140 megawatt system actually is deferred a couple of years. You don't have to do it in 2020. Now you can see if you double your savings per year to 1%, you actually can defer the first upgrade by a year from 2014 to 2015. And if you get your savings up to 2% a year, you can defer it 3 years out to 2017. So again, this just underscores the point that the level of aggressiveness of your efficiency portfolio, your system-wide savings efforts, matters a lot in terms of the degree to which deferrals are actually possible and how far out into the future those deferrals occur, as well as for how many years they will provide that benefit. Now, passive deferrals should be valued whenever you are doing cost-effectiveness screening of your system-wide efficiency programs. They should be captured in your avoided T&D costs. There are a variety of jurisdictions that do assign significant values to avoided T&D benefits, and the Northwest and New England examples are presented here. But there are many other jurisdictions which do not assign value when they do cost-effectiveness screening to T&D deferrals, or they use very conservative approaches. In my view, from all of the information I've seen, I believe Con Ed takes the most sophisticated approach to this, and you will hear a lot more about that later from Michael and Ronny. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes now about active deferrals. Again, active deferrals are situations in which you have decided that you want to try to do some targeted efficiency investments in order to defer a very specific, some geographically targeted investments to defer a very specific upgrade that would otherwise be needed. Now, when you're assessing what you might want to do in this arena, you need to forecast your demand growth and related T&D needs for the different elements of your system. And when you're forecasting demand growth, that needs to be adjusted for the impact of your system-wide efficiency programs. The next step is to figure out, well, how much additional savings beyond the savings I'm going to get from those system-wide programs would I need in order to defer the upgrade at a particular substation or other element of your T&D system? And you could look at several different scenarios for different levels of savings and deferral timelines. Then it's appropriate to estimate what the benefits of that deferral are. If you could defer an upgrade for 3 years, for example, there is a time value of money associated with that and perhaps some other benefits too. Then you need to estimate what the cost of generating those additional savings that produce the deferral would be. And then ultimately ask yourself the question, are those benefits greater than the costs? Now, there are a variety of different ways that you can pursue obtaining those additional efficiency savings in those targeted areas. The first is you can try to accelerate the uptake of existing system-wide efficiency programs, either through more intensive marketing or offering higher financial incentives to customers who are within those targeted geographic areas. A second option would be to introduce new measures or new efficiency programs that are targeted solely to those geographic areas. You can also issue RFPs or have performance contracts with ESCOs or others who are obligated to deliver geographically targeted savings over and above what you might expect from your system-wide programs, or you can do some combination of the above. It's also worth noting that these are all options that you have with respect to efficiency programs. And while this webinar focuses on the role that efficiency can play in deferring T&D investments, it's important to note that there are other demand-side options beyond efficiency as well. There's demand response and distributed generation, for example. And while efficiency can play a very important role, it need not be and probably shouldn't be the only option that gets considered. You can look at different combinations of those different demand resources. So you have a variety of tools at your disposal when you're doing geographically targeted active deferrals. Now, there's a lot of barriers to addressing T&D with efficiency investments. The first is that utilities' financial incentives. They generally make more profit from investments in poles and wires. The second is that efficiency has, as we noted at the beginning, multiple benefits. It saves energy, it saves capacity, it saves T&D, it reduces emissions, it lowers line losses, and so on. And so when you're assessing whether efficiency makes sense, whether it's cost effective, you need to look at that question from a very holistic perspective, which is a little bit different sometimes than a system planner might, than the approach a system planner might take when looking at whether there's a need to upgrade a transmission line or a distribution substation. The third obstacle is that system planning is very technical. I'm not a system planner myself, but the more I talk to people about it, the more I appreciate how complicated it can be, particularly when you get to the transmission level. And so figuring out when and how and what role efficiency can play in deferring T&D systems requires a lot of interaction between system planning engineers and those folks who have expertise in marketing and planning of efficiency programs. Unfortunately, historically, those two different groups of folks don't commonly talk to each other all of that much. As a result, system engineers don't always trust demand resources as much as would be necessary for them to put their faith in a non-wires solution to a transmission or distribution system need. Another barrier is risk aversion. Utilities are traditionally conservative, and because this concept of using efficiency or other demand resources to defer investments in T&D is relatively new in many places, there's oftentimes a hesitancy to buy too much into it. As noted earlier, transmission investments or needs are particularly complicated, but not only technically, but also from kind of an institutional perspective. In a number of jurisdictions, at least, transmission costs are socialized regionally. So, for example, in New England, if there is a need for a transmission investment, typically much of that cost, let's say if there's an investment in Vermont, much of that cost would get spread across all 6 New England states. However, if an alternative path is taken with a significant investment in efficiency and distributed generation, for example, that alternative set of costs would not be shared regionally. So there's an inherent financial disincentive for the Vermont ratepayers or any other state's ratepayers to choose those alternatives, even if they are less expensive in aggregate at the societal level. And then the last point to make about transmission planning is that its responsibility for it is diffuse. Distribution planning is much more localized. Transmission planning requires involvement of the independent system operator, state agencies, and a variety of others, which complicates the assessment of alternatives potentially. Now, despite those barriers, there are a number of examples over the past 20 years or so where there have been efforts by utilities or others to actually deploy efficiency investments in order to defer transmission and distribution system upgrades. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of those, which is the Efficiency Vermont experience, and then we'll get into much more detail with Michael and Ronny's presentation on the kind of really groundbreaking work I think that Con Ed has been doing. So efficiency, in Vermont, we got involved in in a very targeted kind of pilot way, looking at the opportunity to defer some distribution system investments back in the 1990s. And then nothing happened for about 10 years until legislation was passed in 2005 that identified a particular interest in focusing efficiency investments in areas that might defer transmission and distribution system investments. As part of that legislation, the spending cap that had previously existed for efficiency programs was eliminated, and a requirement was imposed on the state's utilities to do 10-year forecasts of transmission distribution system needs. Following passage of that legislation, our regulators took a look at the efficiency budgets and increased them by about 2/3, and suggested that all of that additional spending ought to be focused on 4 new areas, which you can see highlighted in the picture here of the state. And savings goals were established for each of those 4 areas, which were something on the order of 7 to 10 times the historic levels of savings that were realized through the system-wide efficiency programs. To address address those goals and try to capture those significantly higher savings, Efficiency Vermont did 2 things. It began to aggressively market its existing statewide efficiency programs in those areas so that the uptake, the participation levels would be much higher than they are on average across the state. And they launched a new small commercial direct install program, which was targeted just to those areas and didn't exist in the rest of the state. Here's a little bit of information on the four targeted areas. You don't need to kind of memorize all of this information. I think that the point that we just want to make with this slide is that they were a diverse set of areas. Some were more urban, at least by Vermont standards. The Southern Loop, on the other hand, was a very rural area. Some were more heavily dominated by residential versus C&I sales. A couple of them were summer peaking. One was winter peaking, and one peaked at both summer and winter, or had a very similar peak for both. And then the underlying load growth without efficiency programs was quite different from one place to the next. So each of these different areas, because of those different characteristics, required a very kind of customized, targeted approach within the context of the overall strategy. Now, the results for 2007 to 2009 were positive in some respects. Their participation was 3 to 4 times higher in these targeted regions than it was at the statewide level, and the amount of savings realized per participant were about 25% higher. However, because the goals were so aggressive, the summer peak savings were only about 70% of the goals in that time period. That changed a little bit in the next couple of years, where all of the savings targets were met or exceeded. And the bottom line is that most of the T&D upgrades that were targeted have been deferred. The Southern Loop and Rutland upgrades are now determined to no longer be needed. While the Chittenden upgrade is proceeding, it's been determined that the next upgrade after that will be deferred, or has been deferred. And then kind of last example is an interesting one. The Newport substation ultimately was rebuilt. We were attempting to defer the need to rebuild it, but it wasn't through failure of the geographically targeted efficiency programs that it was rebuilt, but because of an unexpected flood. And we'll come back to this when we talk a little bit about conclusions on this stuff, that things happen both positively and negatively that affect the ultimate outcomes here, things that are often kind of outside your control. Of course, that's true of system planning generally. So Vermont has learned a lot through the last 6 or 7 years of this effort to defer T&D investments. We've adopted a more rigorous vetting process for selecting which areas we're going to focus on for deferrals. Responsibility for that process has been assigned to a system planning committee that the regulators set up. As noted earlier, we are doing regular 10-year forecasts of T&D needs. And interestingly, the folks at Efficiency Vermont are working very closely with Velco, our statewide transmission utility, to reconcile the forecast of natural efficiency and other elements of each of their respective forecasts. They had never been kind of integrated and calibrated to the similar set of assumptions before, so that was a really good byproduct of the legislation requiring greater attention to T&D need forecasts. We're now regularly analyzing efficiency potential for 16 different zones in the state. There is a kind of a two-step process that we use. The first is a kind of initial high-level screen. Looks at a set of criteria like whether the need for an upgrade is driven by load growth, how far out the need is, and a high-level assessment of whether efficiency investments have the potential to defer that need. And if you pass that initial screen, there's a more detailed assessment that gets conducted. Ultimately, recommendations are made to the regulators, and efforts proceed, and this is done on an annual basis. We're also beginning to consider whether we ought to move beyond the historic approach of screening efficiency programs where there was a statewide average T&D avoided cost used for cost-effectiveness screening. There's some consideration now being given to whether, at least for custom projects, we have two different sets of avoided costs. One much higher set in constrained areas where we're trying to defer T&D investments, and another lower set of costs which we would use in other parts of the state. Whoops. So, lessons learned. It's clear from the work that's been done in several different jurisdictions that geographically targeted efficiency can actively defer transmission distribution system investments. Those deferrals can be very cost-effective, and I think Michael and Ronny will talk a little bit more about that in terms of the Con Ed experience. There are unexpected events can affect your benefits, both positively and negatively, as noted in the example of the Newport substation in Vermont that had to be rebuilt because of the unexpected flooding event. Sufficient lead time for deferrals is really important, and it gets increasingly important the larger the project that you're considering. If you're looking at just a very narrow area for deferring a very small investment in the T&D system, your lead time may not need to be as large as if you were looking at deferring a transmission system investment, for example, that's serving a much larger area. The corollary to that lesson is that smaller is easier. The smaller the geographic area you're focused on, the easier it is to characterize, the fewer customers you have to treat, and again, the less lead time that's required. The corollary to that point is that deferring investments in the distribution system is easier than in the transmission system. They're smaller, they're less technically complex, and they don't involve as many parties, including the need to deal with cost socialization issues. Cross-discipline communication, that is between system planners and efficiency program planners, is critical, and it takes time to kind of build those relationships, build that communication, and build the trust on both sides. And then it's important to think about, I want to flag this again, the role not just that efficiency can play in deferring T&D, but the role that other distributed resources can as well, whether it's demand response or distributed generation. They are all viable and valid resources, and sometimes they can only be effective when working together. So I will close with some recommendations and then come back to some questions. So the first recommendation is to require least cost T&D planning. Vermont and Rhode Island are two examples of two states that have such requirements. I have published a paper through the Regulatory Assistance Project along with Richard Sedano, and one of the appendices to that paper, which you can find on RAP's website, includes excerpts from the Vermont law and some regulatory language from Rhode Island that folks can consider if that is of interest. The second recommendation is to institutionalize long-term planning. It needs to be at least 10 years out so that you're comprehensively looking at the range of options with enough lead time to actually consider non-wires alternatives, particularly for transmission investments. Work needs to be done to level the playing field for wires and non-wire solutions, again, particularly with respect to cost socialization issues on the transmission side. It would be helpful to begin collecting more data on the detailed hourly impacts of efficiency programs. I think one of the interesting byproducts of the fact that in New England and now in PJM, we have a capacity market that allows efficiency investments to compete with generators. Is that in order to compete, you have to have a good load shape data, and there's been a number of load shape studies that have been undertaken in the region for the purpose of generating that data so that efficiency providers can bid into those capacity markets. That load shape data, however, has just as much potentially, if not more, value to T&D planners, and more of it needs to be collected. Another point would be to consider starting with pilot projects to get your feet wet, learn some lessons, and have some success before moving on to a broader strategy. This stuff is complicated, and so it's important to start with the appropriate size steps. And the last point I just want to raise is that as smart grid investments become more common, they may offer opportunities that we haven't thought of, that I myself probably haven't sufficiently thought of, to get the kind of information that's necessary to inform an effective strategy. So with that, I will conclude and see if there are questions that folks might have asked. And I am not seeing any questions in the chat area. Deb, am I missing something here? Are there questions that have come in that I'm not able to see?
Chris, there are questions. Let me read those for you.
Okay, thank you.
The first one is, Chris said that only investments associated with load growth are deferrable through energy efficiency. Are there any numbers out there suggesting what percentage of total expected T&D investment is attributable to load growth?
That's a great question. I looked for that information when I was working on this report with and for RAP, and I did not find any. I wouldn't be surprised if they exist, at least for individual utilities, but I have not seen any data that are available to characterize that situation generally, and haven't been privy to data at the utility level. Perhaps Michael or Ronnie might have some information to share at some point about that. The one thing I do know about the Con Ed example from stuff that they've written is that over the last 7 or 8 or 9 years, I can't remember exactly how long ago it's been that Con Ed started, they have had geographically targeted active deferral projects that touch something like 1/3 or more of their 90-plus network areas. Unfortunately, I don't have more or better information than that.
Next question is, of the 60% of anticipated T&D growth, how much is for outdated, antiquated grid that must be updated?
That's the second half of the previous question, and the answer is I don't know, unfortunately.
Okay. The next question is, what are the different types of reduced T&D spending? For example, avoided sun station upgrade, avoided new distribution lines to a new generation, etc.
Ronny and Michael may be able to speak a little bit more to this as well, but there are, it's the whole different kind of aspect of the system. There's transmission lines, there's substations, there are feeders, and there are even kind of transformers on individual commercial buildings that are all potentially deferrable. And I should note, if you look at the paper on RAP's website, that I didn't get into all of the different examples, but I believe that between them, there are some examples that touch on all of those different aspects of the system.
Thanks, Chris. Our next question is, what analytic tools, modeling or other, are used by utilities to estimate passive and active deferral to T&D investment?
I'm going to defer that question to Ronny, who I think is going to speak to the work that Con Ed has been doing to assess the potential, not just the potential, to assess the actual deferrals that they're expecting, to forecast the deferrals that they're expecting from their system-wide efficiency programs. I'm not intimately familiar with the details of those tools, but again, from everything I've seen, Con Ed is the most sophisticated utility in the country at looking at this stuff, and so I'm hoping Ronny will be able to shed some light on that, on how they do that.
Our next question is, do utilities typically have the data needed to identify areas needing T&D upgrade, as would be needed to target active deferral programs? If not, what would they need to do to get that data?
As far as I know, I'm not sure why utilities wouldn't have those data. At least at some level. You, as a utility, you should understand, at least from the system planning perspective, what the key parameters are that's driving the need for the T&D investment. And then the only question is, for your efficiency programs, what impact are they actually having on the areas where you feel like you have a potential need for an upgrade? And the kind of information you need for that includes, you know, what level of savings are you going to get, not just system-wide, but what portion of those system-wide program savings are going to occur within the areas governed by your substation or whatever other element of the T&D system you're going to need to defer. And kind of the second key component is you need to understand the timing of those savings, the load shape of those savings, if you will. There are ways that you can estimate both of those things. As I noted earlier, the load shape data is particularly important, and there is a need, I believe, in lots of parts of the country to collect more load shape data to better understand the seasonality and the differentiation by time of when different energy efficiency measures and programs are providing savings. But there are some, there's enough work out there to at least get a decent sense of what that looks like today. Clearly, we can be better and get more information that would be helpful, but there ought to be enough information out there today to get started. And I think Con Ed has demonstrated in the work that they've been doing, which Ronny is going to talk about again shortly, that there is enough information to get started.
Our next question is,
no, go ahead.
I have about 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, there's quite a number more, Chris, depending on how we have time.
We have 15 minutes.
Great. With regard to socialization of costs for alternatives to T&D, does FERC Order 1000 create an opportunity to correct this problem or at least get a conversation started?
I'm not intimately familiar with all of the details of what FERC Order 1000 says or now requires, but my understanding of it, my limited understanding of it, suggests that it at least, because one of the things it does say is that investment decisions at the regional level need to consider state policy, it at least opens the door for kind of more active conversation around this question. I haven't heard anyone suggest that it is a panacea, however.
Okay, the presentation thus far has focused on demand-side energy efficiency. I'm interested in the role of distributed generation, CHP and waste heat recovery, in transmission and distribution savings. Can you provide any background on the role of these technologies and whether there are any utilities that have actively encouraged CHP and WHR to preserve T&D capacity?
I'm not an expert on distributed generation or CHP and or the role that they may have played in different utility jurisdictions in attempting to defer T&D investments. I'll just say two things about it, however. One is, and my friends at Con Ed can correct me if I've got this wrong, but the efforts that Con Ed has undertaken starting back in 2003 to geographically defer, to focus on specific geographic areas to defer investments in T&D, the mechanism they used was to issue an RFP for geographic demand-side capacity, if you will. And those RFPs were not limited to efficiency. As I understand it, distributed generation was one of the options that could have bid in. However, because efficiency is, at least to this point, has been much less expensive, it is only the efficiency resources in that bidding process that have actually been engaged. So at least to this point, or at least the last time I saw the Con Ed data from a year or two ago, there were no distributed generation projects. Maybe that has changed, and Michael or Ronnie can chime in if that's the case. The only other thing I might suggest in terms of a place to look is at the Pacific Northwest, where the Bonneville Power Authority has, I think, reinvigorated in the last couple of years its look at non-wires alternatives to transmission system investments. The last I talked to folks there quite a number of months ago now, there were 3 different projects that were potential transmission projects where there was a serious look being made to whether non-wires alternatives might be cheaper, and non-wires alternatives including not just efficiency but the whole range of demand resources. I don't know the extent to which distributed generation was part of the picture in those 3 cases, but it's at least conceivable that it was being considered, and so some follow-up there might be worth doing.
The next question is, can you talk about the importance of having a good foundation of regular EE program base in developing and implementing a more aggressive, targeted active deferral effort?
Well, that's an interesting question. And one that I actually haven't really thought about, so I'll do this off the cuff. I think it's probably would be very helpful to have a good foundation in system-wide efficiency programs in terms of looking at some additional geographically targeted efforts. If for no other reason than having that foundation means that you've already done a lot of thinking about what efficiency can do. You have some very very important firsthand experience with what it can actually accomplish, and that might generate kind of increased confidence that when you say you can get a certain amount of savings in a particular area, that you actually can. If you've never done this before, even at a system-wide level, you never run an efficiency program at a system-wide level, it's your level of confidence in what you're going to actually get, and that's really important to transmission and distribution system planners, because their job is to make sure that the lights stay on, and if you don't get enough, if you don't get the savings that you promise, there's some risk there. For all of those reasons, I think it would be, it would almost certainly be the case that that areas that have been doing system-wide efficiency programs for some time and have the additional confidence and sophistication would be more likely to be successful in deferring transmission and distribution system investments from geographically targeted efforts.
Our next question asks, when forecasting potential T&D benefits vis-a-vis load growth, do the load forecasts differentiate between growth in net new customers versus load growth driven by increasing average use per customer?
I don't know enough about how different utilities forecast that growth to give you a definitive answer. From some of the work that I have done looking at forecasts however, from our statewide transmission utility in Vermont, it's pretty clear to me that at least here there are a lot of key assumptions underlying their forecasts, including the amount of new construction and new customers, therefore that will be added to the system over time, to changes in consumption of different end uses and different appliances over time to reflect changing federal standards and other changing market conditions, and so on. So from that limited experience, my guess would be that it's pretty common to be able to understand how much load growth is coming from those two different components, but I can't say that equivocally or unequivocally.
Our next question is, any data looking at the effect of time and use rates and impact of energy efficiency programs?
On the T&D system, not that I'm aware of. I know that there have been a number of pilot efforts to look at the impacts of time of use rates on the broader system, but I'm not aware of efforts. That's not to say that they haven't been out there, because I don't do a lot of work on time of use rates, but I'm not familiar with examples where there's been an attempt to assess their impacts on particular elements of the T&D system. It's at least conceivable that time of use rates that are set up to deal with system-wide issues could either benefit or adversely affect peak demands on individual components of the T&D system. Just like some system-wide load control efforts could do that. If you think about an air conditioner load control program, for example, that's designed to lower peak demand at the time of system peak, maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If you stop cycling those air conditioners at 5:30 or 6 o'clock on a substation that is predominantly serving residential customers, the demand at 7 o'clock or 6:30 might be a lot higher after a load control event than it otherwise would have, as the air conditioners are trying to catch up to the heat gain in the homes. And if that substation serving that area was peaking at 6:30 or 7, you could exacerbate that peak. I would imagine the same kind of thing could be possible with time of use rates if they aren't carefully structured to avoid that potentiality. But again, I'm not familiar with examples where that kind of analysis has been done.
I have a question here as to how much the targeted energy efficiency programs in Vermont cost.
Great question. And I am going to have to pull some numbers together and respond to that offline after the fact. I don't have the answer off the top of my head. So if whoever wanted the answer to that could send me an email, I'll be happy to follow up.
I can send you that contact information, Chris.
Great.
The next question is, did Vermont efficiency determine how much of the deferred T&D was due to efficiency and how much was due to the recession?
That's a great question, and the answer is they're still trying to figure that out. I don't know that there is a definitive answer yet, and it's one of the, it kind of points to one of the real interesting things about using efficiency to defer T&D. As I noted earlier, there are some things that can happen that you don't expect that can kind of undermine your efforts to use efficiency to defer T&D. There was an example in one state where the efficiency program appeared to be on track to be successful in achieving a deferral, and then in a particular area, and then unexpectedly a large customer decided to relocate to that area that forced the upgrade to happen anyway. The Vermont example I gave was that there was a substation that we were attempting to defer and a rebuilding of, or an upgrade to, and an unexpected flood ended up requiring the investment anyway. Those are negative examples. Positive examples, and again, our friends at Con Ed can speak to this a little bit more perhaps in their presentation as well. It's my understanding that in several of the cases in New York City where Con Ed has invested in geographically targeted efficiency to defer distribution system upgrades, they ended up discovering that those investments, their forecast of the need for those particular upgrades ended up not being accurate, and for want of a better term, and that the time, the efficiency, the efforts to use efficiency to defer the upgrades bought them enough time to determine that that was the case. So that's another positive example, and kind of the coinciding efforts to defer through efficiency and recession might have had very similar impacts in Vermont, but again, the degree to which it's very difficult to tease out the separate effects of those two things, and I think there's going to be efforts in the future to look at that a little more closely. So maybe one more question if we have them.
Okay, we do. One last question. Can you expand on why updated and more accurate load shapes are so important? What impact have those updates had in your experience?
Sure. Well, I would say that up until about 5-6 years ago, the load shape data that most jurisdictions were using to estimate the hour-by-hour impact of their efficiency investments were coming from studies that were done in the 1980s or perhaps early 90s. That not a lot of that kind of load shape work had been done in recent years. It is really important, and Ronny will be able to speak perhaps a little bit more to this. But if you want to defer investment in a particular substation, for example, you need to know what time of day and what season of the year that substation is peaking. And then you need to be able to determine how much of your energy savings that you're getting from an efficiency program or from a mix of efficiency programs are occurring at that particular peak hour. And if you don't have good information or good confidence in the information that you have around that, it'll force you to be more conservative about what you assume, and therefore either to come to conclusions that that deferral isn't possible or isn't possible economically, or that it won't last as long. And better information in which you could have a lot more confidence ought to be able to, in essence, enable you to unleash more efforts and more successful efforts to defer upgrades through efficiency investments. So maybe with that, and I really appreciate these are all great questions, and to the extent we haven't gotten to some of them, we can try to come back to them later if we have time, and if not, we'll try we'll encourage any of you to follow up with any of us. But I want to make sure we have enough time to get to the Con Ed presentation because they have, I think, some really neat story to tell, and I think may end up addressing some of the questions, at least in part, that have been posed to this point. So, Deb, if you can hand the controls over to Michael and Ronnie, they can go ahead and get started.
I've done that, Chris.
Great, thanks, Chris. Great presentation. So, and I agree. I think we'll be able to maybe clarify some of the questions that were asked earlier, and maybe extend on some of your explanations as well. Again, this is Michael Harrington. I'm a manager in the Energy Efficiency and Demand Management Department at Con Edison. I'm joined here by Ronny Sandoval, a colleague of mine in the Energy Efficiency Department. So we're going to expand on and extend the presentation that Chris just gave to talk specifically about Con Edison's experience in both the passive and active deferrals of T&D using energy efficiency more specifically. I will also touch on some of the things that we're doing now and we're looking at in the future. Some of those things included targeted demand response, distributed generation, and of course that would include CHP. So I'll touch on a little bit more about how we are thinking about CHP to address that earlier question a little bit later in my presentation. So briefly, I'm going to go through just kind of a brief introduction of the Con Edison system, the areas that we focus on, why we focus on those areas, some fun facts about the system that are interesting that kind of show the unique opportunities and challenges we face in this particular service area. Ronny is then going to give a presentation on how we integrate all of our energy efficiency programs into a forecast and how that gets integrated into our system planning. And then I'm going to come back after Ronny's presentation and do a deep dive into the targeted DSM program, the Targeted Demand Side Management Program, which is our primary and active deferral program, and talk about the history of that program and the characteristics of that program, the successes and lessons learned of that program. And then we'll wrap up with questions, and then we'll be done. So I'm going to begin now by going, let's see, sorry, I had an agenda slide. I forgot to advance it. Here we go. Sorry about that. So that's what I just spoke about. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Con Ed landscape. And I really like this slide because it shows, it's essentially a distribution system heat map of Manhattan. And it really does a great job illustrating some key characteristics of the Con Ed system in particular. And one of the key characteristics is that it's extremely dense. You know, our service territory is only about 660 square miles. So relating that, I was thinking about what size that was relative to that map of Vermont that Chris showed earlier. I imagine it's a pretty small, very small area on that map. That being said, you know, very small service territory, but we have over 130,000 miles of T&D cable in the ground. You know, the density of our system is about 20 megawatts per square mile. Now that serves over 9 million people, and of course, you know, hundreds of thousands of businesses, residences, and the country's, if not the world's, largest commercial office space market. So that presents some particular challenges for us, but also some particular opportunities for energy efficiency. Certainly the challenges and opportunities come from the density makes it very, very expensive, or maybe much more expensive than average to install new distribution assets. Certainly digging up the street in, say, Midtown Manhattan, where there's 70,000 people per square mile and a very, very, very dense electric system, it's quite expensive. So, you know, that has led us to, you know, really, I guess, almost 12 years ago, start looking at energy efficiency, or really other alternatives to very expensive T&D upgrades. So that's kind of what got us to where we are now, thinking about what are the alternatives than closing down, say, Broadway for a couple of days and having to dig up that street. So the next slide really shows what we consider, or what we really think about when we're looking at the value of energy efficiency, and we're weighing the value of energy efficiency against alternative investments. So of course there's the energy savings that customers see, the energy savings that translate into less energy that we have to purchase for our customer. Of course the T&D savings, which is what we've been talking about. Line loss savings, which is an interesting one most people don't think about, but we deliver less energy through energy efficiency. We pass along less line loss. Of course, capacity savings, so the demand savings behind the meter actually go all the way up the supply chain, and in a lot of cases, if you get enough of it, you need less generation or less new generation. And of course, the environmental benefits of energy efficiency. I know many other utilities, including ourselves, really look at energy efficiency not only as a T&D resource, but also as a carbon reduction resource and to provide other environmental benefits. But of course, we're going to focus on the T&D savings in this particular presentation. But I just wanted to put this up there to show that we do consider all these other benefits. Of course, all these other benefits go into our cost-benefit calculations for our programs, which then in turn get used as a T&D resource. So I just wanted to kind of put that up there as a way of introduction, probably preaching to the choir to some extent here. The next slide here, I wanted to, again, show a quick introduction of where Con Edison is in the electric system supply chain and the areas that we're focusing on, because this may be a little different than some of the other utilities out there and maybe some of the other models that you've seen. So of course, up until the late 90s, Con Edison was a vertically integrated utility. We owned everything from the generation down to the meter. But in the late 1990s, New York State restructured the electric market, where they actually, where we divested almost all of our major generation to third-party, I guess, into really a competitive market to third-party companies, and the generation side of the market became competitive. Again, also in the late 90s, our transmission assets were transferred to the control of the New York Independent System Operator, so the New York ISO is now under the control of all the transmission assets. And then Con Edison was left as a distribution company. So from the late 90s till today, we're focused really from the sub-transmission down to the meter. And that really, this is really important because it colors our view, and it colors the way we design our programs, and it colors the way that we do forecasting and the way that we design our programs. By way of example, in the 90s, Con Edison ran a program called the Enlightened Energy Program. And that was a massive energy efficiency program that ended up reducing demand by, I think, about 600 to 700 megawatts over the course of the decade. But that program was focused on transmission and generation. Since we are vertically integrated, we ran that program system-wide and focused on generation and transmission assets. But since we're a distribution company now, our programs and the targeted program that you'll hear about later in the presentation and the forecasting that we do is really focusing on the transmission substation through the distribution system only. And now, while we do coordinate and integrate with the New York ISO for system adequacy studies and those sort of things, we're not focusing our programs on transmission and generation specifically, which I think is an important distinction to make. So this is a timeline which Ronny will actually expand on as it applies to forecasting in particular, but just wanted to kind of walk you through where we have been really in the last 12 years in our thinking with efficiency and our market. So of course, as I mentioned, in the late 90s, really 1999, 2000, the market was restructured. Again, generation and transmission were out of our control, and of course distribution only. So in 2002 and 2004, we started the targeted DSM program. So this was our first foray back into energy efficiency post-market restructuring, and this was an active deferral program. And I will speak extensively on this in the second half of this talk. We also started our demand response program. So it's important to note there, because we started the demand response programs in the early 2000s, but they were mainly for day-to-day system operation and system reliability, and they weren't really used for T&D deferral until really last year. And Ronnie will show you a timeline of where all the different programs came in. So for the most of the 2000s, really from 2003 up until now, we ran the targeted program, and that was, again, an active program. Important to note also, in the 2009-2010, we had a very large portfolio of energy efficiency programs started, and Ronnie will talk in much more detail about those programs and how they're included in our forecasting and planning. But I also want to call to your attention on the right-hand side of the slide is that the active and passive energy efficiency are not the only things that we're looking at for as alternatives to traditional T&D reinforcement and infrastructure investment. We have a number of other initiatives going on within the company, which we're not going to cover in this presentation, but it's something that people should be aware of. Looking at voltage optimization, alternative and next generation and innovative system design. Of course, looking at the various different other tools we have besides energy efficiency, and then also focusing more on the customer side load shaping, so demand control, those sorts of things that are enabled through battery storage, ice storage, those sorts of things that will help us lower peak, but also increase asset utilization. So really, this was a brief overview of where we've been and the system. So hopefully that will provide some background to the items that we'll talk about later in this presentation and why we're focused on distribution and substations. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Ronny Sandoval to talk about how we integrate DSM into system planning.
Again, thanks, Michael, for that introduction. Again, I work with Michael in the Energy Efficiency Department in Edison, and I'll try to guide you through just some of the methods that we've actually undergone in order to integrate demand-side management in its various forms into our system planning. Okay, so as we mentioned before, in the early 2000s, we introduced the targeted demand-side management program. And as it relates to some of the concepts that Chris mentioned in his presentation, the targeted demand-side management would be characterized as an active program. So this was geared towards deferring specific capital investments in areas of constraint. So, for example, we would target maybe an additional transformer or an area station. We would look to defer that area station by implementing energy efficiencies in those areas of constraints. So that's essentially what makes it an active program. Later on in 2008 and 2009, we had a number of state-mandated programs that really were geared towards encouraging energy efficiency across an entire system. So this was these programs were not demand-focused, such as the targeted DSM program was, but it was more energy savings over the course of the year. So the introduction of these two programs, both run by the utilities and other state agencies, really led us to try and develop a model so that we could translate those annual energy savings into demand savings that we can actually build into our forecast and put into our planning model for consideration. Later on in 2010, we looked toward another state agency, namely NYPA. They were doing their own energy efficiency programs, which are similar to the demand-side management, the targeted demand-side management program, in the sense that we knew where they would be. It wasn't, for example, specifically a system-wide program. However, it's different in the sense that they weren't specifically geared towards capital deferrals. It was more of a, we knew where they were, but they weren't necessarily in the places where we needed to defer a particular investment. And lastly, last year we began to introduce some of the impacts of a few of our demand response programs that we had sufficient data in order to include in our forecast and into our system planning models. Okay, so this slide over here, it actually illustrates how our demand-side management fits into our peak load forecast and into our planning process as a whole. So we have, if you look towards the left, we have demand-side management and demand response, which is our typical programs. But we also, someone mentioned distributed generation. We also take into account some of the distributed generation assets that we have in our system that we can reliably count on. We have some performance data, and we've been able to count on to be there during peak times, during the network peak times. So both of these components are inputs into the peak load forecast. So the outcome of this is that we have a peak load forecast that is net of these two components and essentially reduce the overall peak load forecast over a 10 or 20-year horizon, depending on the planning assumptions that we're looking to make. So these forecasts are then supplied to various engineering groups over the company, including area station planning, some of the regional distribution groups, transmission planning, central engineering, and based on this forecast, they look at where the load growth is, they look at the existing capability of the system, and they identify whether the existing assets are adequate in meeting the demand of the 10-year or 20-year forecast. If some of the assets are not sufficient, we look towards identifying projects that could help us meet those demand needs. So if we take into account the demand-side management, we effectively reduce the load going forward and could potentially defer some of the projects that may have been identified in the past. So this is just a illustration of the kind of impact that demand-side management has on load growth as a whole. So we're looking at the 2012 to 2021 forecast, and the top line, the red line that you might see, is the load growth projected, including all components except DSM. So if you take into account the demand-side management, the impact of the demand-side management programs as a whole, you'll see that we end up with a 1.2% compounded annual growth rate as opposed to 1.6 if we don't include DSM in the forecast. Okay, again, so this might illustrate a little bit better how it fits into the load forecast and into the planning process. So we're looking at a specific substation that provides for a load area. And the load area forecast, the base forecast without the impacts of DSM, begins in the year 2012 with 197 megawatts and ends in about 216 megawatts. Directly below that, you see the impact of projected DSM programs across the 10-year horizon. And you see that the demand-side management programs result in a reduction of about 10 megawatts by the end of the 2021 year. So we look at the line below that is the impact taken into account demand-side management in the overall forecast. So this is net of DSM. And the last line is the capacity of the area station, essentially the capability to provide load. If, based on the capacity at 200 megawatts, we would have exceeded, if we don't include DSM, we would have exceeded the capability of the station by the year 2014. And at that point, we would have put in an engineering solution, maybe install an additional transformer or some other method of relief. But if we take into account the projected impacts of demand-side management, we see that the project is essentially deferred until the year 2018, which is when the capability or the capacity of the area station goes above 200 megawatts, as I identified there. And at that point, you see that the capacity grows to about 250 megawatts when an additional engineering solution is installed. But that 250 capability would have been added in the year 2014 had we not factored in DSM or had those impacts not been captured. Okay, so our overall approach, and this is specifically geared towards the system-wide programs. For the targeted DSM, we have some idea. We have contracts. Michael will go over what that entails, but we essentially know the magnitude and the location of the demand-side management program or projects that targeted DSM is looking to defer. However, for the system-wide programs, we have essentially energy-saving programs that, again, are energy savings across the entire year, and we don't know specifically what network, what load area, what region of our system those will actually, where they will materialize. So we have, this is an overview of our process. So it's initially what we do is we first allocate the energy savings to the network, and this is going back to some of the concepts that Chris mentioned before. You need to know when the network peaks in order for you to figure out really what the impact of the programs are. You'll have a very different demand savings based on the hour of day, and essentially that's dictated by the network. So we first, before we actually do a translation into demand, we identify where what networks the savings will materialize, and that in turn guides what the projected demand savings would be. So once it's allocated, we convert the energy savings to demand savings using some of the load shapes, again, that Chris mentioned before. So we have annual load shapes for essentially all the measures that fit into a lot of these demand-side management programs. And based on those load shapes, we know that for a given hour, and we look up what when the network peaks, we actually identify what the demand reduction would be for that peak time. Lastly, in order to account for the variability of where some of these demand-side management programs will actually materialize, we essentially we account somewhere in our model for that uncertainty. So, for the most part, we have up until this point, we have an expected value of where the savings would be allocated. However, in order to give our engineers and our planners some level of certainty, we try to account for this variability of where the outcome will be in order to mitigate the risk of under or over forecasting. Okay, so I'll begin with the portion where we allocate the energy savings. So again, these energy savings are in KWH or MWH because a lot of these statewide programs are geared towards energy savings over the course of a year. Those savings may result in demand reductions based on the types of measures that are employed and the customer segment that you're looking to target. So, in order for us to actually allocate these savings, we would have to have some intimate knowledge of exactly how those savings would allocate for a particular network. A lot of that data, a lot of these programs are new, so we don't have a lot of the data that might tell us what for example, the level of penetration that we may expect to see in a given network. Also, essentially after some point there may be some saturation. So we don't have, at this point, we don't have a level of confidence in the sense of the potential that we may have in a given network, and because again these programs are fairly new. So what we use as a proxy function for the distribution of energy efficiency is essentially the consumption data for each of these networks. And what we've done is we've broken down the consumption by service class, which in turn allowed us to group these programs towards the segment that they're focusing on. So for example, we grouped a lot of the residential or single family or multifamily commercial and large commercial customers based on their service class. So some of these programs focus specifically on residential customers. So what we do is that we allocate the energy savings towards the networks or areas where you would find energy savings consumption or energy consumption in those categories. So if a particular load area has a higher level of single family than another network, then we would project that a higher level of the energy savings would be allocated towards that network. So in essence, we've taken the service class data to come up with these customer segments that the individual programs cater to or are designed to provide savings for, and we identify where those savings might appear based on the network and the kind of customers that comprise that network. And this goes again towards the how we convert these energy savings to demand reductions. Someone mentioned, what are the kind of tools that we use to do this conversion? So we use Cadmus Portfolio Pro, which is a tool that was actually used to come up with these programs and try to assess the level of savings that we would expect to see over the course of a year. Now these load shapes have essentially an hourly value of the total annual savings that you would expect to see for a given hour. So for every hour, you have a percentage of the annual savings that you would expect to see for a particular measure. And based on So a measure might be lighting or cooling. Now, we would know, for example, for a residential program, we would have a curve for a particular measure, and based on the measures that that program provides, be it lighting, cooling, heating, we generated these load curves based on those measures. So you see here, the residential programs have a slightly different curve than what you would see in the multifamily, based on the measures that are employed and the behavior of the usage of that measure. So we've generated load curves for the different types of programs that we actually administer, as well as some of the programs that the state agencies administer, and essentially have a value for the peak hour and the peak day, which allows us to convert to provide for the energy savings or demand savings for a given network. So if a given network peaks at 7 p.m. and we have the contribution of the various programs, we can convert the annual expected energy savings to demand savings. Now, in terms of addressing the variability of this method of allocation, it's essentially what we have up until this point is an expected value. This tells us that essentially, since it's an expected value, it's 50% of the time we can expect to achieve a specific value for demand reduction. Let's say it's 10 megawatts of demand reduction. 50% of the time we can expect to have 10 megawatts or more. 50% we can expect to have 10 megawatts or less. This kind of variability is not really adequate for system planning, because there's too much variability. You don't have enough reliability in the numbers. So what we've done up until this point is reduce the actual projected savings by about 50% in order to account for the expected variability across these networks. Over time, we're looking to analyze just how accurate we've been in terms of allocating the savings, and this number or this discount factor, essentially for variability, would probably change. But essentially, it's only over the course of a number of years where we'd essentially have some confidence in what that number exactly might be. Over the short term, we may have some short-term variability in what we forecast versus what actually materializes. But over a number of years, we expect that this distribution and this allocation method would essentially be evened out. So one additional note is that this reduction is not applied at the system forecast, because we do have a certainty that the savings would happen somewhere in the system. However, we're not, because we have to allocate it to specific areas of the system. Whenever we do that, we apply this discount factor. So some of the impacts and results that we've observed. So we know here that DSM has proven to be a viable low relief option, particularly in the targeted demand side management program, which we've had a longer track record and more information in deferring capital investments. Some of the improvements that we made, particularly starting to account for the variability of the allocation has led some of the engineers and the planners to be a little bit more confident, because we are discounted by a very big amount, essentially 50%, and we have a pretty decent way of allocating the savings. They've grown more confident in that, in the sense that these demand-side management programs are actually achieving the results, and not only that, but where we say they're going to be. In addition, because and you saw in the previous slide, demand-side management is essentially it's another line item in the forecast. So it's visible, people are aware of it, and a lot of people ask a lot of questions. How it impacts the system plan. So we've grown. There's a lot more support for demand-side management, and we've refined the process based on a lot of feedback that we've received. And the last note is that we state that we positively impacted customer bills, and this translates into this is a result of the various programs that or the projects that we've looked at in the 10-year low relief program that we've essentially been able to defer because the presence of the demand-side management program. Lastly, I touched on this a little bit before, but some of the feature work that we're looking to pursue is whether the penetration of the consumption, the penetration actually mirrors the consumption pattern, whether the allocation that process that we've taken and based on the consumption actually mirrors where the savings materialize. And again, over the short term, you may see some variability, but we believe that over the long term, over a number of years, energy savings would materialize, essentially where consumption lies. It's a little bit better than using past performance, because at some point you may have a lot of success in a particular network, or one particular program might have great success in some network, but at some point that network may become saturated. The measures that you employ at that point are no longer as effective. So but rather than using strictly past performance, we believe that this method is adequate. And again, there may be some short-term variability with when it materializes. And lastly, we forecasted primarily at the network level or our high load area. However, we could, for example, target feeders and some of the lower components of the distribution system with some programs, but at this point there's too much variability at that local level to allow us to forecast effectively, specifically a lot of these system-wide DSM programs. And now I'm going to turn it over to Michael, who will discuss a little bit about the targeted demand-side management.
Great. So I'm going to talk for the next couple minutes about the targeted program specifically. So I talked about it a little bit earlier in the presentation, but this is the active deferral program that we also include along with these other energy efficiency programs that Ronny just spoke about. So a lot of the issues around geographic variability and matching the program savings, the kilowatt savings, and the load curves, et cetera, and so forth, are not issues with the targeted program, because the targeted program is focused on KW and it's focused on particular networks. So those are included in the forecast at their full value, and then the translations are not needed. But a quick history of the targeted program: we've been running this since 2003, I'm having a little trouble advancing the slide here. Okay, there we go. So we've been running the program since 2003, and really the impetus for creating this program was in our 2003 rate case, where we faced a significant amount of capital expenditures due to load growth. So we worked very closely with the New York State Public Service Commission to develop a program to include energy efficiency as an alternative to supply-side infrastructure investments. So the program, as I mentioned, the program uses the same 10-year forecast that Ronny described earlier, and really focuses on specific geographic areas and focus on peak demand. Because of that, the risk that we have is really just non-performance, and I'll speak a little bit more about how we measure performance and how we ensure performance and how we reduce risk in the program. Sorry, having trouble. There we go, advancing the slide. So just a very brief overview of the magnitude of the targeted program. Today we've put about 107 megawatts of demand reductions in the ground. That translates to about just under 280 gigawatt hours of annual energy saving. So that's what we've done since 2004. To give you an idea of the costs and benefits, to address some of the questions from earlier, by our calculations, the program has created $464 million of net customer benefits. So that includes all 5 of those benefit categories that I spoke about in the introduction. 221 million of those has come from the T&D category only, so pretty significant savings, especially when you consider that we only spent $145 million to put that 107 megawatts in the ground. So, quick math, it's a benefit to cost ratio of 3.2, which is quite good. Interestingly, if you break it down, in our particular case, the commercial projects had a higher benefit to cost ratio than that 3.2, and the residential were lower. And there's a variety of reasons for that I won't go into, but it's interesting and when you look at the portfolio, but really it's important to look at the individual different customer segments. So how does the targeted program work exactly? So again, as Ronny had mentioned earlier, system planning through a forecast that also includes some DSM, identifies the shortfalls. Those shortfalls then come to us, and we work very closely with our engineering groups to identify which projects and which engineering solutions are good candidates for deferral through energy efficiency. We then essentially run with those projects and issue RFPs out to the market, asking for bids for delivery of energy efficiencies on a certain schedule. So for instance, you have a program that requires a 1 megawatt reduction for the next 3 years to defer a project. So we would ask for ESCOs to bid what could they deliver those, can they deliver those savings, and what can they deliver them for. And we then compare the costs that we receive in those bids to the benefits that we calculate through those categories I spoke about before, but of course would include the project-specific T&D benefit. Those bids are selected, we contract with the ESCOs, and then those ESCOs go out and are to date have been primarily responsible for all the sales and marketing and implementation of the programs. We sign these firm contracts. We have strict measurement and verification. By strict, I mean 100% pre-inspection and 100% post-inspection requirements for all projects and all measures. This ensures that when we count a KW, we are confident that KW has been achieved. Last but certainly not least, there are liquidated damage clauses in our contracts with the ESCOs that provide significant motivation to the ESCO to meet their annual goals as outlined by our load relief needs, but also helps protect the utility and the customers, because the liquidated damages is essentially designed to cover the cost of emergency deployment of backup generation or other emergency measures to address if there's a shortfall in the ESCO's delivery. So, we recognize we are taking a risk in not putting iron in the ground, so to speak, by putting energy efficiency in those networks, but we do account for that risk and try to defer those costs to the ratepayers. So, while we're paying an ESCO to do the work, if they fail to perform, it doesn't cost the ratepayers any additional money. This is a fun visual example of exactly how we do this. So this is just well, not imaginary. This is the Lower East Side of Manhattan, if you recognize it, but this is an imaginary project. So we would actually identify a specific area. So say, for instance, this is an area that encompasses a network that's fed by a particular substation that has a load relief needs. Then we would contract with that ESCO for energy efficiency. So to date, it's been primarily energy efficiency. And, while we have done it at the network level, Ronny mentioned that it is possible also to target energy efficiency at the distribution level. And while there's a lot of uncertainty around accounting for the benefits at the primary and secondary distribution level for system-wide programs, not the case for targeted programs. So you can actually target specific streets, specific intersections, specific couple of blocks, and you know where it is, and those allocation uncertainties and those sort of things go away. So it is possible, and we have done some work targeting kind of smaller areas in the distribution system, and we are certainly looking to expand those in the future. Let's see if my graph works. So just what came up on your screen there is the actual demand response. So it's dashed because it's showing that we haven't actually targeted demand response yet, but it's something that we see the potential in doing. We see the benefits of demand response, and we think targeting demand response in a similar fashion to targeting energy efficiency could have similar or the same benefits. And we're in the process of evaluating the relative cost effectiveness of demand response, energy efficiency, and potential. At the end of the day, we think distributed generation is also going to play a part in the mix. So going back to the CHP question from earlier, we certainly see that CHP and similar other customer-sided resources have a part to play in targeted DSM. It's called targeted DSM and not targeted energy efficiency because we look at everything. But because of the way that the contracts have been structured in the past, we've essentially gone with the least cost option, and that's been energy efficiency. I'll talk a little bit more about what measures we installed there, but certainly distributed generation and DR are in the mix for the future. I guess one specific note about both is that reliability and the way that we back up the customer are key. So, for example, in a CHP example, reliability is key. So it's a customer-operated and sited resource. So, program designs and future incentives and those sort of things, if they materialize, we'll focus on making sure that those resources are up and running and providing the demand reductions that we need and the customer can provide at the times that we need it. And then the other thing is actually backup service. So many distributed generation customers also have backup service from Con Edison in the event that the DG is not operational. And this poses an issue for us because essentially we are deferring T&D resources. But if the T&D resources have to be put into the ground to provide the backup service for that particular DG asset, then you're not getting those T&D savings because you're having to build it anyway, and you're recovering those costs through backup rates. So, to the extent that we don't have to do that and we don't have to provide that backup, then there could be significant T&D savings from DG and CHP. I'm advancing one slide. I'm actually probably not going to spend a lot of time on this because I definitely want to get to your questions. Again, having trouble advancing. I'm going to actually skip this slide for the sake of time, because I want to talk about the features, and I want to call out the specific features that we think were key to making the targeted program work and that will make it work in the future. As I mentioned, the rigorous M&V, I just want to highlight that again. The security and liquidated damages, I think, is a key component because it provides financial motivation to the ESCOs for meeting their goals on time and in full. And again, as I mentioned, it provides cost recovery in the event of underperformance. Another key feature that shouldn't be lost is that the measures are limited to those that provide peak load reduction. So unlike the passive energy efficiency programs that Ronny spoke about and Chris spoke about earlier, the measures that are allowed in the targeted program are specifically chosen as peak reduction measures only. So while our focus is KW versus KWH, the design of the program and the allowable measures is quite different than a program that focuses on KWH. I think that's an important feature there. And the physical assurance for DG. So this is actually the other side of the coin to us not having to provide the backup capabilities. And this is actually an interesting case because distributed generation has been an incentivized measure in the targeted program since 2004. However, no DG projects or CHP projects have been done. And one of the major reasons is that for physical assurance. So essentially, physical assurance is saying that if you put in a 500 kW DG unit, you have to guarantee that that 500 kW, one way or the other, is off of our system. In a lot of cases, that's difficult for customers to do because of lack of controls in the buildings or lack of I guess, confidence in their DG or just for operational reasons. We're not really sure, but that certainly is a speed bump that we're going to have to address in the future to get more DG if it does enter into the part of the mix. Very quickly, I'm just going to talk about the measures that we did. The key takeaway here is that because we relied on least cost energy efficiency and bids from the market, we did about 95% lighting. So many of you, I'm sure, they're very familiar with energy efficiency measures. Lighting is one of the most, if not the most cost-effective out there. So if you're looking for the lowest bids and the most competitive bids, you're going to get a lot of lighting, and that's what we saw. It's been very effective, but moving forward, where lighting maybe not provide the low-hanging fruit anymore or the best opportunities, we certainly need to look at other measures. Key takeaways: coordination and communication with engineering and planning groups is essential. So this goes back to some of the items that Ronny and Chris spoke about. That energy efficiency and demand management and demand response and the actual system planners and forecasters need to be in close and constant contact. Vendor management and contracts are key. Of course, we're taking a risk by putting these contracts out there and relying on non-engineering solutions to address load relief. So certainly that is very key, that those are very closely managed. Flexibility to adjust, modify, and terminate contracts based on changing load relief needs. So this is interesting, and it goes to the recession question that was asked earlier, is that we actually did see the impact of the recession on our needs. We had load forecasts that showed needs out into the future. We put targeted contracts in place. The recession hit, and the new forecast came out, and those needs were gone. So we adjusted our targeted needs, and in some cases eliminated those targeted contracts into the future because those needs disappeared. So building that flexibility into the contracts and into the process from the very beginning gets all parties on the same playing field to set the expectations. Coordination and communication with other programs and company initiatives, and this is particularly important for Con Edison where we are now, because there's many other groups focusing on alternatives to traditional supply-side infrastructure investment. So we are coordinating with them because in some cases energy efficiency may not be the most cost-effective solution to a particular problem. So certainly we need to work with everyone else in the company that's working on alternative solutions to assess what is the most cost-effective. And last but not least, the utility branding and direct support makes a big difference. So initially the programs were designed where the ESCOs did all of the marketing and sales themselves. But in the New York market, there was a lot of skepticism and I guess apprehension to sign up with these ESCOs for the programs because of some of the retail activities that had preceded it. So by putting the name of the utility behind these programs and having a utility representatives out in the field really made a big difference in customer sign-ups. And I think that's a pretty big lesson learned that we learned along the way and had to make some adjustments. Sorry, trying to advance slides. Next steps, we have a new $100 million program that we're in the process of designing. We're looking to adjust the measures that we deploy, looking to adjust the program model and strategies, taking the lessons learned from the program and really looking to build a stronger program, more integrated program, looking at other resources other than energy efficiency and other than lighting, to build a more comprehensive, integrated, targeted program, and of course integrate those with the other things that have emerged within the company since 2004. So it's pretty exciting times. You know, we're looking at a lot of different things. We had a lot of success in this targeted program, but we're not resting on that success and really looking to retool and rework the program to fit the current needs. I want to just call your attention to two particular resources where you can get more information about the information that Ronny presented on energy efficiency forecasting and some of the information that I talked about for the targeted program. These two links will provide you to two papers that were written on both of these subjects and provided quite a bit of detail, substantially more detail than we went into today on these two subjects. We encourage you to download those, read those, and reach out to us if you have any additional questions. With that, I'm going to wrap things up and address any questions in the, I guess, 30 seconds that we left for questions. Sorry about that.
So, Michael, this is Chris. I think we're at the witching hour here. Maybe you can take a couple of questions if you can go a couple of minutes late. And as I start seeing the attendee list shrink, if it looks like it's shrinking a lot, I'll just suggest that if it's okay, if folks follow up with you with whatever additional questions they might have, that would be great. And I'll just note in passing one other quick thing that I think I'm not sure Ronny mentioned, and if he didn't, it's worth mentioning because it shows up in the paper that you referenced, that the passive deferral benefits, as I recall, Con Ed has estimated that integrating that benefit into their analysis has enabled you to defer or to save about $1 billion over 10 years or more on your T&D system, which is pretty remarkable. So maybe we can take a question or two, Deb, if you want to flag what those might be, and then we'll drop off and wrap it up in a couple minutes and have Michael and Ronny follow up with others as needed.
Absolutely, Michael. Can you see the questions, or shall I read them to you?
Yeah, if you could just read them to me. I'm not seeing them. Oh,
sure, actually, no problem. The first one is, have you or any other utility started to look not only at how demand resources can defer future investments, but how they can be used to optimize the utilization of existing T&D assets?
So the question is not only defer T&D upgrades, but to increase the utilization of existing. Absolutely, and that's actually when I mentioned load shaping earlier on in that timeline in kind of 2011 going forward. So we're very interested in controls. We think going forward, building management systems and demand control softwares and those sort of things that are integrated with efficient equipment, DR enabling equipment, certainly energy storage, thermal storage, those sort of things, we're very interested in, because not only do those decrease peak demand, but they can use off-peak power to, say, store thermal energy or store electric energy for deployment during peak. So to the extent that that flattens customer demand curves, that will certainly help flatten our load duration curve, which we think is very important.
Our next question is, are there several ESCOs doing targeted DSM work, and how many responses do you typically get when an RFP is issued?
That's a good question. We actually only have one ESCO currently still doing work, but historically we've had 5 successful bidders in the history of the program. The reason there's only one left is because all the other contracts have expired and the commitments have been fulfilled. For typical responses, I actually don't know. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Usually, it's quite a few in the past, but we haven't issued a new RFP for this program because we've been concentrating on delivering the actual contracts, I guess, since 2008. So I guess between 2004 2008, I want to say maybe half a dozen to a dozen. It's certainly not 20 and not 2, but somewhere in between there. So sorry, I can't be more specific, but a number.
Thank you. Do you think that the cost-effectiveness screenings governing current state energy efficiency programs, particularly the TRC as applied in New York, that they adequately account for the macroeconomic and ratepayer benefits that these installations provide from a T&D deferral perspective?
That is a great question, and that is a question that we are asking ourselves, and I know that a lot of people across the country are asking. I think that we do use the TRC. We use that for our energy efficiency programs, our demand response programs, and our peak shaving demand response programs, and the targeted program. I'm not sure. It's kind of a loaded question. I'm not sure the answer, but I know that we are looking at alternatives, and I know that people, including our regulators, may be interested in alternatives. I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's very difficult to capture all of the benefits in any of the tests out there, because I think certainly they all have required trade-offs. But I think the TRC is pretty good. It's for our purposes, but it's hard to say what we'll use going forward. It's hard to say if the TRC is better or worse than any of the others out there, because we really haven't studied it in detail yet. But we plan to.
So maybe we should take one more and then call it a day and have others follow up as needed.
Great.
Okay, our last question is, how can energy and capacity markets be used to promote the use of demand-side resources as transmission alternatives?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that, because we're not focused on transmission alternatives here at Con Ed. I believe PJM does a significant amount of demand response. The other day I heard 10% of their capacity is in demand response, and I believe all of those resources are actually bid into the capacity market there. We don't have that here in New York, or we don't have that here in our Con Edison system. So I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm sure that if done right, it can be a benefit. I'd be curious to know what PJM's success has been.
So maybe I'll just say one last thing myself in response to that question, which is that I'm not sure directly what energy and capacity markets can do to help with the use of efficiency to defer T&D, other than to make sure that that some of the other benefits of efficiency are captured, are monetized. So that if you're an ESCO trying to deliver some T&D benefits, you can have multiple revenue streams to cover your costs, and that might enable more efficiency in a fully market-based mechanism to penetrate. But that would be kind of just the indirect effect. In any case, we're well past the planned endpoint at 3 o'clock. I want to thank Michael and Ronny for a great presentation. Again, I think Con Ed is doing really neat, cutting-edge stuff with the look at the role efficiency can play in deferring T&D. This was very helpful. This presentation and the recording of it is going to be available on RAP's website if anyone wants to listen further. Again, if you have questions that weren't answered by either me or by Ronny or Michael, please forward them to us, and we will attempt to get back to you. And last note, as I said at the beginning, at the outset, our friends at RAP are going to be sending you an evaluation or a link to a very brief evaluation of this webinar, and we would very much appreciate it if you take the 1 or 2 minutes it would take to complete the evaluation so we can get feedback on how we're doing and what we can do to better serve your needs. So with that, we'll close the webinar for today, and thank everybody, and see you again hopefully in a few months. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.